Are you tired of feeling overwhelmed by the chaos of modern life? Do you crave tranquility and inner peace? In this video, I will share with you the ancient philosophy of Stoicism and how its timeless wisdom can help you navigate life's challenges with grace and resilience. Stoicism, a philosophy founded in ancient Greece, offers a powerful framework for living a good life. It was founded by Zeno of Citium in the early 3rd century BC and flourished in both the Greek and Roman world until the 3rd century AD. Stoicism is not just an intellectual pursuit, it's a practical philosophy designed to be lived, guiding us on how to respond to life's inevitable ups and downs. At its core, Stoicism teaches us to focus on what is within our control, accept what we cannot change, and cultivate virtue in our thoughts and actions. By embracing Stoic principles, we can find inner peace even amidst life's storms. In today's fast-paced and hyper-connected world, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, stressed, and anxious. We are constantly bombarded with information, demands on our time, and unrealistic expectations. It can feel like we are on a never-ending treadmill, chasing after external validation and material possessions. The relentless pursuit of more money, more fame, more stuff, leaves us feeling empty and unfulfilled. Our minds are cluttered with worries about the future and regrets about the past, leaving little room for peace and contentment in the present. Furthermore, the constant comparison to others fueled by social media can lead to feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt. We may find ourselves constantly striving to meet the standards set by others, rather than defining our own path and values. This is where Stoicism comes in. It offers a way out of this endless cycle of striving and dissatisfaction. It teaches us to find contentment in what we have, to appreciate the present moment, and to focus on what truly matters. Stoicism offers a radical alternative to this way of life. It teaches us to turn our attention inward, to cultivate inner strength and virtue. One of the core tenets of Stoicism is the dichotomy of control. We must learn to distinguish between what is within our control and what is not. By focusing on what we can control, our thoughts, emotions, and actions, we can free ourselves from the tyranny of external circumstances. Another key principle of Stoicism is the practice of mindfulness. By paying attention to the present moment, without judgment, we can cultivate a sense of inner peace and clarity. Stoicism also teaches us to embrace the impermanence of life. By recognizing that everything is fleeting, we can learn to appreciate the present moment and let go of our attachments to things that are beyond our control. The concept of amor fati, or love of fate, is central to Stoic philosophy. It's about accepting everything that happens, good or bad, as necessary and even beneficial to our overall journey. This doesn't mean passive resignation. It means actively embracing challenges as opportunities for growth and learning. Negative visualization is another Stoic practice that can be surprisingly empowering. By imagining the worst-case scenarios, we prepare ourselves mentally for setbacks and develop gratitude for what we currently have. This practice can help us reduce anxiety and fear, allowing us to face life's uncertainties with greater courage and equanimity. The Stoic virtues. Stoicism emphasizes 4 cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Wisdom is the ability to see the world clearly and make sound judgments. It involves seeking knowledge, understanding, and discernment in our actions and decisions. Courage is the strength to face our fears and do what is right, even when it is difficult. It is not the absence of fear, but rather the triumph over it in the pursuit of what is virtuous. Justice is the commitment to fairness and equality in our dealings with others. It means treating everyone with respect and dignity, regardless of their status or background. Temperance is the practice of moderation in all things, avoiding excess and maintaining balance in our lives. It encourages self-discipline and control over our desires, leading to a more harmonious and fulfilling existence. Moreover, Stoicism highlights the interconnectedness of these virtues. Wisdom guides us towards the right actions, courage empowers us to carry them out, justice ensures we treat others fairly in the process, and temperance helps us maintain balance and avoid extremes. By cultivating these virtues, we can strive for a life of moral excellence and fulfillment. In addition to these cardinal virtues, Stoicism also emphasizes other important values such as honesty, integrity, benevolence, and self-respect. These values are essential for living a virtuous life and contributing positively to society. Stoicism in daily life. Stoicism can be seamlessly integrated into our daily routines. Start your day with a moment of reflection, considering the challenges you may face and how you can approach them with Stoic principles. Throughout your day, practice mindfulness by paying attention to your thoughts, emotions, and actions. When faced with difficult situations, pause and ask yourself, what is within my control? How can I respond with wisdom and virtue? Incorporate Stoic practices like journaling and meditation into your routine. Journaling can help you gain clarity and perspective, while meditation can cultivate inner peace and calmness. By incorporating Stoicism into your daily life, you can gradually transform your mindset and approach to life's challenges. The Stoic practice of self-examination is another powerful tool for personal growth. By regularly reflecting on our thoughts, emotions, and actions, we can identify areas where we need to improve and make conscious efforts to cultivate virtue. This practice can help us develop self-awareness and make better choices in line with our values. Stoicism encourages us to focus on the present moment rather than dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. By embracing the present, we can fully engage in life's experiences and find joy in the simple things. Stoicism also teaches us to live in accordance with nature, recognizing our place in the grand scheme of things and finding harmony with the natural world. Stoicism and relationships. Stoicism can profoundly impact our relationships. By practicing empathy and understanding, we can cultivate deeper and more meaningful connections with others. When we approach others with a Stoic mindset, we are more likely to listen attentively, offer genuine support, and avoid unnecessary conflict. Recognizing the common humanity in all of us, Stoicism teaches us to treat others with respect and kindness, regardless of their differences. By cultivating compassion and forgiveness, we can overcome resentment and build stronger relationships with those around us. Stoicism also encourages us to be mindful of our own emotions and reactions, avoiding impulsive behavior that can harm our relationships. In the Stoic view, our relationships with others are an essential part of living a good life. By fostering healthy and supportive connections, we can create a network of mutual respect, understanding, and care. This not only enriches our lives but also contributes to the well-being of those around us. Stoicism and adversity. Stoicism provides a robust framework for dealing with adversity. When faced with challenges, Stoicism reminds us that we always have a choice in how we respond. We can choose to dwell in despair or to find meaning and purpose in the midst of suffering. By focusing on what we can control, such as our attitudes and actions, we can maintain our inner peace and dignity even in the face of great difficulties. Stoicism teaches us to view obstacles as opportunities for growth and learning. By embracing challenges, we can develop resilience, perseverance, and a stronger sense of self. The Stoic approach to adversity is not about denying our emotions, but rather about managing them in a healthy way. We can acknowledge our pain and sadness, but we don't allow these emotions to control us. Instead, we channel them into positive action, using our challenges as fuel for personal growth and transformation. As Marcus Aurelius, the great Stoic emperor and philosopher, wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This quote encapsulates the essence of Stoic philosophy. By focusing on our inner world and cultivating virtue, we can find true freedom and happiness. Epictetus, another prominent Stoic philosopher, taught us the importance of distinguishing between what we can control and what we cannot. The chief task in life is simply this: to identify and separate matters so that I can say clearly to myself which are externals not under my control and which have to do with the choices I actually control. By internalizing this distinction, we can liberate ourselves from unnecessary suffering and focus our energy on what truly matters. Seneca, the Roman Stoic philosopher and statesman, offered profound insights into the nature of happiness and tranquility. He reminded us that true happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future, not to amuse ourselves with either hopes or fears, but to rest satisfied with what we have, which is sufficient, for he that is so wants nothing. The Stoic path is not always easy, but it is a path that leads to tranquility, resilience, and inner strength. By practicing Stoicism, we can learn to embrace life's challenges as opportunities for growth, find peace in the present moment, and cultivate virtue in our thoughts and actions. It's a philosophy that invites us to live more intentionally, to focus on what truly matters, and to find contentment and peace within ourselves. If you are ready to embark on a journey of self-discovery and inner transformation, I invite you to explore the wisdom of Stoicism. Subscribe to this channel for more Stoicism-related content and share your thoughts and experiences in the comments section below. Remember, the path to a good life begins with a single step. Take that step today. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.